Should we get started then? It's 2 o'clock now. Professor Buraselis, would you like to do
Yes,
this?
I'm ready to do it. I'm expecting the signal from the speaker. Katerina, να ξεκινήσουμε. Πώς θα βλέπεις? Okay. Well, dear friends, we're approaching the end. Christina Costantakopoulou and I will be chairing this last session of this so interesting telemeeting. And our first speaker, who is ready to begin, drinking the last drops to strengthen herself, is Katerina Panagopoulou. Katerina needs no introduction from me nor from anyone else. I shall suffice myself to say that she represents not only in Greece, but internationally, the very important category of ancient historians who combine ably numismatics and ancient history. And the subject that she will present, monetary change, lies in the center not only of her mind, but also of her heart. We're listening to you, Katerina.
Thank you very much indeed for an extremely flattering introduction. I will try to actually live up to it. Well, oops, I've just started, sorry, I just got into medias res. Okay. Forming part of material culture, money constitutes a category whose emergence and development through to the Roman period can be placed under the microscope in conjunction with at least some of Davies' 5 predominant factors of change: the exceptional individual, population, the environment, the supernatural, convertible resources, and memory, imagination, and identity. The present paper aims to show how and to what extent the nature of monetary transactions changed from the Archaic through to the Roman period. At the heart of this definition lies the notion of money, which has challenged from a quite early stage prominent scholars. Admittedly, stricto sensu, the notion of change is inherent in a numismatic context. After all, it is the word change that denotes in modern English the conversion of coins into specimens of different, most often smaller denominations in the same or in a different metal during the exchange for commodities both within and beyond the numismatic standard. But one may certainly move beyond that. Even if coins were the most explicitly organized system of monetary instruments, the traditional identification of money with coinage is clearly challenged at key moments in monetary history, not least in the introduction pattern of coinage. The archaeological evidence has now made it clear that the notion of money preceded the emergence of monetary transactions and the gradual transition from object to coin exchange. An explicitly numismatic focus admittedly leaves out of this equation an equally broad spectrum of transactions not held in coinage, but rather in kind or in pure bullion, for instance. In other words, the actual definition of money may be taken as open and pertinent to a mutual agreement of users, ideally corroborated by the state. It is worth disentangling from the very beginning a discussion of monetary change from a description of the strictly numismatic narrative. At the core of this paper title lies the distinction between two notions, monetary and numismatic. One must admit that a more technical paper on the numismatic narrative would only partly describe monetary change, leaving out of the picture a significant range of monetary transactions and transitions not held in coin, but in other forms, namely in kind or even without coin, coinlessly. A consideration exclusively of the numismatic resources in order to unpack monetary changes would admittedly be incomplete and fragmented. Monetary changes include numismatic changes, but they go far beyond the instrumenta monetaria. This is thus considered best to describe monetary changes not ad hoc, presenting a linear change of transitions, but rather against a broader frame describing the diverse functions and motors of ancient economies. Considering in each of the above case studies a synergy of either of the above motors, I shall attempt to consider the entanglement of each of the above factors by reviewing briefly the following critical case studies. In the first place, the very introduction of coinage. I was wondering, can you see the PowerPoint? Is that okay? There is also a handout which has been put up by Kostas on the Padlet, apparently, with some basic bibliography. In the very first place, the very introduction of coinage, which apparently emerged through the interaction between Greeks and Lydians, was a major technological innovation. There is no doubt that it brought forth a prominent monetary revolution, which is worth examining more closely in its contemporary setting. It is a most pleasant coincidence that a spectacular 707-page new volume on the early electrum coinage, published by the American Numismatic Society, has only now just appeared and reached the private library in Athens 10 days ago. The volume is the outcome of two major conferences on early electrum coinage, one in Jerusalem, combined with an exhibition set up in 2012, which you see on the right-hand side, and one in New York in the following year. One may draw from its most complete collection of data, numismatic, scientific, epigraphic, literary, etc., on ancient electrum coinage, important information which is pertinent to the present discussion. The earliest electrum coins were produced in Asia Minor by scores of producers, including the Lydian king, who had rapidly managed to control all of West Asia Minor to the west of the Halys River and prominent Greek cities such as Miletus or Ephesus. These agents began to strike small, pre-weighed and pre-formed pieces of electrum, i.e. a locally found alloy, carrying and design. Several series of such coins were found at the Artemision, the temple of Artemis at Ephesus, especially in the central bases. A reassessment of the excavational material by Kirchner and Konuk corroborates the striking of the first coins to approximately 650 to 625 BC, the electrum coins having been deposited at the Artemision bases shortly thereafter. But while there is no doubt that the emergence of this coinage fostered a major change in monetary practices in Asia Minor, the impact of this change may not be observed immediately after that. One may plausibly wonder with Van Alphen and Wartenberg whether the introduction of coinage reshaped transaction practices immediately or whether it functioned alongside the existing transaction practices. As clues to pre-coinage transactions may be detected already in Homer, and as finds of hoards of hack silver, that is, sorry, this is the electrum. Finds of hoards of the hack silver, that is cut silver pieces in the Near East, demonstrate the conduct of transactions without coinage already in the 2nd millennium BC and the remarkable spread to the west by 900 BC. Greek cities may well have formed part of this long-established tradition before minting their individual coinages. An inscription from the Artemision excavations dated before 570 BC, in which donations or revenues acquired by the temple are quoted in a minted bullion, show that a few days after the actual emergence of coinage, electrum coinage was refused in offerings to the temple, leaving thus pure gold as the preferred currency in transactions to the temple. Possible changes in the variations of weight and alloy have been evoked as a plausible explanation for the refusal of the temple authorities to accept electrum coins in transactions. In his systematic dye study of the prominent coins of Phanis, Fischer-Bossert shows that the weight and alloy of these coins changed over time. Thus, the treasurers at the Artemision may have sought to avoid uncertainties by preferring raw gold and silver bullion to electrum. The actual reason for the minting of electrum coin specimens in the first place is to be sought in Davies motor E convertible resources, even though resources here are not just converted, as electrum was a natural alloy. Admittedly, the Lydians had access to naturally abundant electrum in the region, from which they derived significant wealth from exploiting the gold found in the Pactolus River. In addition to Herodotus' report of the Lydians' activities in this area, a metal analysis of the alluvial gold of this river has revealed that the native gold available to the Lydians contains 7 to 80% gold and 20 to 30% silver. Fischer-Bossert's dye study of the Phanis coinage, the prominent electrum coinage struck on the initiative of the only individual nominated explicitly on this, Phanis, allows for subtle, deliberate adjustments in weight and alloy pertinent to the demand for such coins, leaving open the question whether similar adjustments also took place in other such coin series. Arguably, the distinctive feature in electrum coins compared with Hag silver was evidently the trust offered to coin users through designs and legends. Between the emergence of coinage and its undertaking by the state, one may place an intermediary burst of a plethora of new coin types, which have arguably been associated with groups or individuals, possibly among the elite, i.e. bankers or merchants who minted their own coins. Thus, one may agree with Van Alphen that the appropriation of coinage by the state must have come about through a process of state building and negotiations among the elite members of the archaic Lydian society. Bresson cogently argues that electrum coins might have formed a natural alternative to the need to fix the gold to silver ratio at an early stage, avoiding thus variable exchange rates which could undermine the system. This might have explained their immediate popularity, while a steady stream of electrum coinage arguably continued to be issued primarily by producers in Ionia, Caria, northern Aegean through to the late 6th century BC. Even though the transition from the electrum to the gold or silver coinage must have taken place not long after the beginning of minting, it is most remarkable that popular electrum coinages, such as those produced by Kyzikos, Miletus, and Phokia, did not come to an end when gold and silver currencies were introduced, but were continued for 2 more centuries, i.e. through to the late 4th century, presumably because their popularity with the grain trade. We have thus got so far the exceptional individuals, namely the members of the aristocratic Lydian elite, including Phanis. 2, population, the appropriation of minting process by the state, which establishes electrum coinages. 3, the environment, the Pactolus River, where electrum could be found as a natural alloy, and the technological know-how in enhancing the coin specimens and in separating gold from silver. 4, the supernatural, i.e. the deposition of these coins at the Temple of Artemis, but the rejection of electrum coins later in transactions at the temple. 5, convertible resources, electrum alloy and technological know-how. It is worth pointing out that emphasis on the identity is not yet on the agenda. On the contrary, the plethora of iconographic types on the early electrum coins may be taken to indicate the lack of specific identity, but an attempt to generate trust is already discernible. As for the transition from the electrum to the specific gold and silver issues, we have now got possibly, the exceptional individuals using gold and silver for the first time. Second, population, And 3, convertible resources, i.e. resources and the technological know-how. The refinery discovered at Davies, for instance, may have formed part of the Lydian systematic efforts to distinguish silver from gold in the 6th century BC. Second case, the formation, development and transformation of a dominant weight standard in the classical and Hellenistic period, the euboi et Attic, based on a status of 17.2 grams, will constitute our second case study. It is remarkable that Greek cities in the Archaic and Classical period had developed a number of monetary systems based on different weight standards, i.e. monetary conventions based on units of weight, the fractions or multiples of which provided the system of denominations of a coin issue. The best known such standards in the Archaic and Classical period were the Lydo-Milesian, the Persian, the Euboic Attic, the Aegeanitan, and the Corinthian. They are explicitly sketched by Somar in the Harris and Lewis 2016 volume. While swapping from a weight standard to another might equally be a way of addressing historical and economic change, I will for the moment focus on the Attic weight standard and observe its longer-term development from the Archaic to the through to the Roman period. Yes. Developing possibly on the margin of the electrum coinage, from which, however, it may have drawn its initial iconography and which it may have actually coined itself electrum coins, Athens was one of the cities which struck coinage at a quite early stage. The striking of coinage by this city was not a surprise, as it did possess an endless source of appropriate convertible resources, i.e. the ever profitable mine at Laurion. The structure of Athenian coinage and the main phases it underwent had engaged several numismatists and other scholars over the last 2 centuries. The main corpora of the past century were codified in 2007 by Christophe Lamont, who made them more accessible to a broader audience. I surely do not intend to bring owls to Athenian experts here. Suffice it to sketch briefly the main landmarks of Athenian coinage. In addition to the electrum coinage, which according to Sheedy, Athens may have struck during the 6th century BC, the earliest coinage took the form of the so-called Wappenmünzen, which you saw the previous slide in here, which have been interpreted as individuals' badges. By 527 to 508 BC, the individual's initiative to strike coinage, forming part of the mechanisms of contemporary trade, had been embraced by the polis state. The earliest owls must have been struck by 500 BC and were soon followed by smaller denominations. Contrary to the Wappenmünzen, these early owls circulated broadly. In addition to the addition of the olive leaf and of a crescent after the Persian Wars in 479 BC is perhaps the key addition to a design which will henceforth be produced nearly industrially through the development of key issues on the design. The emergence, at some point, the Athenians also strike decadrans. Be it as it may, here is the reverse of the decadram. The owls gain in popularity up until the 3rd century BC, when they blocked access to Laurion for the Athenians as a result of the establishment of the Macedonian garrison in Attica, posed difficulty in the extraction of silver. The so-called P-style coins and the heterogeneous silver coinages which were struck during this period are examples of very rough metal elaboration and execution. To the above specimens, one may add the extremely rare gold Athenian coins, which were struck subsequent to the Peloponnesian War and under the tyrant Lacharis. That the Athenian silver tetradrams were reformed during the 2nd century into the new style tetradrams was indeed a marker of a new era. Thinner flanks are combined with different designs. The owl is stepping on an aphora on the reverse. A reed surrounds the entire design, while the rest of the flank on the reverse is flooded with magistrates' names. But already in the classical period, the enactment of the coinage decree in the 420s had been a deliberate attempt to regulate the allies' tribute payments to the city. while the emergence of officials, such as the dokimastis, controlling transactions in the agora in the Athenian law of 375 BC, not only denotes legal change, but also corresponds to the need of the state to control more closely transaction processes, to identify forgeries and to combat fraud. It is worth noting that imitations of the mainstream key Attic weight types on the fringes of Athenian markets echo the broad economic appeal of the above coinages even beyond the direct Athenian realm, while the very use of tokens, i.e. coin-type objects employed at various other informal occasions within the city, attests explicitly that coin use had been so deeply conceptualized that it expanded to other sectors of the society. Bronze coinage was introduced in Athens after the Peloponnesian War. Here you have a look of, you get coins which have been marked by the dokimastis and which have been withdrawn from circulation. A major expansion in the Attic weight standard in the 4th century BC was achieved through the gradual integration into it of the Macedonian realm during the 4th century BC. It was a striking by Philip II of gold coins and later by Alexander III, also of silver tetradrachms on the Attic weight standard, that essentially led to the monetary integration of the Balkan Peninsula with Asia Minor and the East. The potentially negative effects on the local markets that the decisive choice of the Attic monetary system by Alexander the Great, also for his coined silver money, had were initially mediated through his parallel striking of posthumous issues in the name of Philip II, continuing the lighter weights which had been adopted by his father, but carrying his individual designs. Eventually, these negative effects were annihilated thanks to the successful Asia Minor expedition and the gradual unification between the markets of Asia Minor and Greece. But I should like to draw your attention to the actual nature of this change. Much ink has been spilled in the 1990s and possibly also today in order to deconstruct the general idea introduced by Thomas Martin's 1985 Coinage and Sovereignty in Classical Greece that Philip II abolished civic coinages in Thessaly. Even though this theme has been evoked even more recently by researchers, little attention has been paid to the actual nature of this last reform by Philip and by Alexander, respectively. It is worth pointing out that no actual violence of any sort was inflicted in order to achieve this major change. Rather than imposing any change on the weight standard of other polis, Philip first and Alexander later were ready to adapt the Macedonian royal issues to the most popular Attic weight standard, rendering them compatible with the most prevalent contemporary economic system. The entanglement of the Roman denarius into Attic standard coinages and markets, and the embedding of this unified economy into the respective Hellenistic societies ultimately shaped an almost globalized economic and social mare nostrum. Within this system, gold coinage was produced and circulated on a far more limited scale as it stood for greater values. However, it is more often represented in courts than it was apparently used. Now, credit. Obviously, not all transactions within this system were conducted in cash. That is shown, for instance, by the coexistence of coins with bullion or with jewelry and precious metals in courts and elsewhere. Indeed, lending, borrowing, and sharing could also offset the lack of coinage, which was a commodity subject to the laws of supply and demand. In times of need, sanctuaries such as the temples of Apollo at Delos and at Didyma or the Artemision at Ephesus were a major source of credit for both private and public clients and safeguarded valuables and loan contracts. In the late 5th century, the Athenians borrowed money from temples and on a small scale from banks, providing social mobility to some bankers. The emergence of deposit banks in mainland Greece in the 5th century and in Rome at the end of the 4th century BC is a landmark in their respective economic and social developments. In Ptolemaic Egypt, only royal banks were entitled to change currency and control the price ratio between silver and bronze. From the late Ptolemaic period, the kolibistika trapezai, private banks, expanded from foreign exchange functions to deposit banking. For the rest of this paper, I would like to ask, what structural effects did monetary change have upon the ancient worldwide economic system? It is at this point that I would like to revisit Hopkins's seminal amended 1995 model of the Roman economy, as I believe that if adapted, it may be efficiently employed also in the present case in order to help us understand how the classical and Hellenistic economies worked and changed in the longer term. In a series of most influential articles, which were published in 1980, 1994, and 1995, which you have on handouts, and which may be found in your handouts, yes, Hopkins argued quite convincingly that it was a large-scale interconnections between three factors: rents, taxes, and trade, which were endorsed by Rome, that prompted a more intensive use of coinage and ultimately transformed the structure of the Roman economy in the longer term. Emphasis was placed in the large-scale interconnections between these three factors: rents, taxes, and trade, rather than on their precise measurement. Hence, attempts to quantify remain at present outside of our endeavor to identify the channels that regulated the flow of money in the classical, Hellenistic, and Roman econoscapes, and how these ultimately change with time. In his 1995 amended version of the model, Hopkins identifies 5 intersecting planes in the Roman economy. A, the natural economy; B, that of bronze coinage; C, that of silver coinage; D, that of gold coinage; and credit. The natural economy was large, mostly self-sufficient or consumed locally. Taxes and rents were in kind and were delivered without market transactions, sometimes traveling over long distances. They had increasing importance in the late 3rd and in the 4th centuries. Peasants intersected with the money economy for the purchase of food, for taxes, which were raised in kind. It was the upper class, large landowners, that needed money in order to pay taxes and rents and to participate in trade. Bronze coinage, for the most part, circulated locally and intersected with the natural economy and with the silver economy. Peasants sold their surplus in order to cover their needs. They purchased goods or exchanged bronze coins for silver. The plane for silver coinage was huge. As Duncan Jones remarked, under the Roman Empire, gold became the dominant coin in aggregate value. 1 denarius equaled 4 sestertii, which was enough to feed a family for a day. The fact that the volume of Roman coinage expanded shows that the surplus in the economy was becoming increasingly more monetized. The plane of gold was more limited than that of silver. Gold was more important, judging from its representation in hoards. Hopkins argues that the Roman economy became increasingly monetized. Priority was given in the value of gold coin and in the expansion in the volume of silver coin. We know nothing about the velocity of coin circulation. We may only assume that gold coins circulated more slowly than silver. A gold aureus equal 25 denarii, i.e. 100 sestertii, would have fed a family in Rome for a month. Thus, it was the rich Romans, the merchants, and the government who would resort to gold coin when they wanted to move money from one region to another. We're talking here about high volume, high value trade, i.e. trading luxuries for sale in Rome. Gold by all means mattered more than silver. Last but not least came credit. Rathbone, for instance, argued that in the Fayum monetization was not limited by the quantity of coin in circulation, but that it was extended through the operation of credit arrangements by private banks and by the state. In that way, the volume of coins was increased. Thus, the integration of the Roman economy was achieved through the tax-raising power of the state and through the purchasing capacity of the elite living in Rome in the first 2 centuries AD. Much imperial and aristocratic income was spent in Rome. The capital of the empire was the main motor of economic integration. Hence, the conquering Romans managed to turn their political power into an economic advantage. It was taxes and rents that brought luxury to the metropolis. They were raised in money, or those in kind were converted into money by government agents in the provinces. The government and the elite had a limited demand for food. Both had a much greater need for money. For money enabled them to buy specified goods at a distance in time and place where the rents or taxes were originally exacted. The Roman government in the first 2 centuries AD produced much more coins than in the last 2 centuries BC, silver and primarily gold. That shows that the coinage system was gradually unified. All coins in use in the Roman world were now minted by the Roman government. The growth in the volume of coinage was on such a scale without any corresponding rise in prices that we may assume that trade had also grown. Thus, the surplus had become more commercialized. The prime stimulus to this limited economic growth was the exaction of taxes and rents. The transfer of high-value gold coins and credit transfers led to a long-term balance between the tax-paying and the tax-receiving regions of the empire. Most of the Roman economy remained local and circumscribed in that producers, including farmers and artisans, consumed their own produce or sold the bulk of it locally. But the relatively sophisticated, relatively integrated monetary economy sat on top of this basic natural economy. It was ultimately the relatively sophisticated and integrated sector of the Roman Empire which helped the empire maintain its political unity. Having said that, what am I supposed to make of the money flow and change through the economic structures of the Archaic, Classical, and the Hellenistic world, taking as well into account John Davies' list of the 5 factors of change? First, the role of the, of the individuals. Individuals, known in names or as groups, have been identified behind major innovations in the history of money in the classical world. They are present, for instance, in the minting of the earliest electron coinage, the renowned Phanes being one of the known members of the Lydian elite who pioneered through the minting of coins. They may have lagged behind the continuation of the electron coinages at Cyzicus, possibly commissioning the Cyzicean state to mint on their behalf coins popular in transactions, or behind the earliest Athenian silver coins, the Vapen minting. While the role of Macedonian kings in prompting changes may be more self-evident, it is worth noting that Hellenistic hegemons are also credited with major innovations. Ptolemy I, Seleucus I, and Antigonus Gonatas, for instance, are credited with the minting of transitional tetradrachm issues with the Alexander types, but carrying their own names on the rivers and in the beginning of their individual coin issues, which circulated for long alongside the Alexander type silver coinages. Second, weight change was in effect the key criterion which endorsed or moderated the validity and trust on coinage from the Archaic through to the late Hellenistic period. The popularity of specific coinages obviously guaranteed their long-term circulation through the Archaic, Classical, and Hellenistic economies and their long use in their respective econoscapes. Such was the case for the earliest electron coinages, whose circulation alongside the silver in a designated area, primarily related to the Black Sea grain trade, was far longer than is generally assumed. Also, the Athenian tetradrachms, their Alexander counterparts, and Roman denarii form the canvas of what has been termed as the long-living Attic weight standard. Their popularity and diffusion through communities triggered coin imitations which circulated broadly, primarily in the fringes of their respective realm. Athenian, Philip, and Alexander imitations constitute eloquent such examples. The state also eventually became obliged to protect its own coin, producing legislation or assigning officials the task of testing and ensuring the validity of the coinage circulating within its market, confirming thus the main point in Davies' article on democracy without theory. It even imposed on its dependents its own regulations, as was the case with the Athenian coinage decree of the 420s. Such regulations are admittedly missing from other parts of the Hellenistic kingdoms. Third, arguably, taxation was a formative pattern for the spread of coinage also through the classical and the Hellenistic world. The Athenian Empire is an eloquent, arguably the first such example in imposing its own weights and measures, i.e. its coinage, on its members. The Hellenistic world is rather more fragmented in these terms. While taxation existed in the Seleucid and in the Ptolemaic realms, there is an article by Monson 2015 in your bibliography, the Antigonids never imposed taxation on the Greek, on those under their control. It was a Roman taxation system which unified the Mediterranean world along the lines described by Hopkins, and which gradually led the unified Mediterranean world to economic growth in the first 2 centuries AD. Obviously, trade was a key motor in the economy throughout. 4, the supernatural was present in placing, for instance, the earliest electron coinages under its aegis, or in providing credit for both private and for individuals. Memory, imagination, and identity were endorsed through the designs and legends of coins. Political change left obvious imprints on civic and royal coinages, changing designs and legends. However, different strategies to these are detected among coin mints ranging between iconographic inertia, i.e. 4th century Athens or the Alexander coin tetradrachms, to more regular changes in the designs by medium or minor political players. I have deliberately left to the end military endeavors, which were admittedly the primary motors for striking coinage, not least along the provision of mistoi in Athens and the emergence of professional warriors, mercenaries representing the first main international motors, coming only second best, sorry. I think I have used a lot of your time. I just wanted to say that basically coinage was the instrument of economic transaction, has it changing forms as markers of economic change. The gradual inclusion into the Attic weight standard, also the Athenian and Alexandrian markets, conferred changes upon the structure of the entire worldwide market of the period. Later, the entanglement of the Roman denarius into Attic standard coinages and markets, and the embedding of this unified economy into the respective Hellenistic societies ultimately shaped an almost globalized economic and social mare nostrum. While the emergence and development of important institutions enabling transactions, such as banks or the antallacteria, which facilitated swapping from one coinage to another, in conjunction with coinless forms of transactions, or with the parallel existence of use of what may be termed as liquid wealth, i.e. that coming from booty, raw bullion, and from other forms which are currently hard to trace, constitute gray areas in our understanding of a contemporary economic activity. Attic weight coinages, well spread through the Mediterranean econoscape, ultimately constituted the economic canvas on which diverse Hellenistic activities, including monetary transactions, were held. Thank you.
We also thank you, Katerina, for this overview with precious insights, I would say, of monetary development and change in this long period of time. I think there are many points where one could begin discussing, not least concerning the interconnection between the factors of change, as you have systematically represented them. But I am sure that there will be many discussants to appear. I shall ask Christina Costantakopoulou to help me in finding out who have already presented an interest in asking questions and discussing with Katerina. Christina?
There are no raised questions and raised hands as far as I can see.
Okay, you can raise your hands now, whoever wishes to do so. I'm sure that Katerina is a very interesting person to talk with.
It's Hans. Hans van Wees has a raised hand.
Okay.
Okay.
Hans, you have the word.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And thank you, Katerina. Extremely interesting paper. Question about trade. I understood when you talk about trade, you mostly probably have in mind a long distance trade, like overseas trade and the taxation on that. If so, I just wondered, there's this famous find of the colophon hoard from the late 6th century, which has, to everyone's surprise, huge numbers of very small denominations, many dies, and so, implying tens or hundreds of thousands of coins struck in really small denominations, which probably, point to, if to trade, to local market exchange. So I wondered if the local market and indeed, retail trade features in your picture of numismatic change, of monetary change at all.
The thing is, I wanted to say things about the the local trade, but then there was too much to actually. I tried to integrate too much information in my hour slot. Obviously, my time slot. Obviously, local trade is particularly important, but I try to show the big picture as it emerges in the broader world of the broader Hellenistic Roman world. But obviously, the fact that there are small denominations from a quite early stage suggests that there was exchange, and that it was quite sophisticated at that time.
But do I understand you're saying? I understand you want to paint the bigger picture, but you are arguing that the long distance trade was more significant in creating monetary change, or indeed that monetary change had more of an impact on the large scale overseas trade than the local variation.
When talking about entanglement, I mean, I think one has to inevitably, it depends on how close one's camera goes to the to the smaller transactions or to the broader movements. In order to see the broader movements, I had to actually not pay much attention to them, to local exchange. Obviously, it is important, but we don't know whether it is held in coins. I mean, there's a lot which cannot trace because, I mean, there is obviously other forms of exchange practices which take place, which we cannot really, there is no way we can have track of them. Through the existing evidence. So, for instance, the broader exchange in kind cannot be traced most of the time. So, in that sense, I tried to focus on the broader map. But obviously, it's very, very important. And well, thank you for pointing this out. One needs to actually elaborate a bit on this.
It's Vincent's turn, and then it's Veronique's turn.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Katerina. This is very, very interesting and very wide-ranging. I know it is impossible to get everything to the big picture. Nevertheless, I would like to point at at least two things that I think deserve to come into the big picture. One of them is something that Klaus Brinkmann has documented some time ago, namely the donations of the Hellenistic kings of huge amounts of grain to cities which are converted into cash. Klaus Brinkmann called them cash machines. You put in grain and then it comes into the cash on the other side. But I think much more, something that deserves much more to be mentioned is the involvement of the state as an active partner in these credit transactions. And the earliest instance I know of that practice, is Xenophon's proposal in his Poroi that the state establishes a fund. It's called a start-up fund. I've treated that in a work that appeared a couple of years ago. The start-up fund is a foundation. The state makes a fund, and from that you offer loans to people. I mean, the state is engaged actively in credit operations. And then, of course, this development leads up, in my eyes, to what we have as an institutional innovation in the Hellenistic period, namely the Demosia Trapeza, the state bank. First time attested in Miletus in the 230s, and then in other cities, among other on Delos, as Veronique also has mentioned in several of her works. So I think these are institutions that present something new in the Hellenistic period, but as I see, it is presaged, is a development starting up in already, or it's proposed already in the 4th century, mid-4th century by Xenophon in his Poroi.
Thank you very much, Vincent. I know you have also written a lot on banks, and that is a very, very important topic. One needs to put them into the discussion, bring them in more actively into the discussion. I just squeeze them in, I must say.
No, the practice much better from Egypt, but I think the Hellenistic cities have also developed that system of the state banks, or the state involvement in active involvement in credit operations.
As for the grain, obviously, grain is money. I mean, one can take it as an equivalent for money. It is not a coincidence that Solon equates the weight of all, the properties of all people in Medimnoi, in grain. So.
Katerina, may I put a question while we are at it? Did I hear rightly? Did you say that the Seleucids did not tax their subjects?
No. I said the Ptolemies and the Seleucids tax their subjects. It's the Antigonids who have imposed taxation. Okay. Or we have no evidence. So we're talking about a fragmented picture in the Hellenistic period. I mean, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies tax their populations, whereas the Antigonids do not. And that is where I think the booty comes up, and the payment. There's all this, this money which is around. It does not go to any state, and obviously mercenaries have the opportunity to take advantage of it. For instance,
Veronique.
Yes. Thank you, Katerina, for this beautiful paper. I have a question about the end of your paper and the question of the coming of Rome, because as Vincent referred to recently, there was during the Hellenistic period a huge credit everywhere in all the categories of the populations, and a huge habit to use public or sacred funds for credit and for several purposes through loans and so on. But my impression is that the Roman power had a quite different idea about what it should mean to use public funds, how people shall use them or not, how the magistrates may be engaged and finance some activities and so on. So my impression is that there is really a gap between the Hellenistic practices of public credit and the idea of the Roman power about public credit. How do you see this question as a numismatist? Of course, we know that the denarius came late in the exchange processes, but do you have a picture, an idea about this confrontation between the Roman idea of circulation of coinage and credit and the Hellenistic one?
Actually, I should elaborate a bit on that. I hadn't thought of that, I must say. So thank you very much for pointing this out. There is obviously two different conceptions. There's a lot of work which has been done on this by Jean Andrew and by other colleagues. So obviously one will need to see how that gets integrated, because in terms of one will need to actually use other evidence. Not, coins don't take us anywhere. One would need to turn to the epigraphic evidence and to look at other material, obviously, in order to come up with more with a more coherent narrative on this. But I think I should work on this and elaborate on this in the written version.
John Davies has his hand up.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Good. This is a minor point, well, perhaps not a minor point, in response to Vincent comment about money lending to individuals. I think, and the startup fund, which he mentioned that Xenophon had proposed, I think that is not, in fact, as new as Vincent perhaps was suggesting. The temple of Rhamnus, temple of Nemesis, at Rhamnus, was lending money out in the 440s BC at the level of 200 drachmae or 300 drachmae or thereabouts. And the document which we have increases in sophistication every year, or every year that they make a mention of it. We can't date it precisely. And the figures there are remarkably like the figures which are reported for the will of the elder Demosthenes in the 370s, when he was lending out money in 200s and 300s. So it looks as if at least the Nemesis shrine was in the business of being a moneylender really quite early on.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, John. That is very important.
Vincent wants to reply.
Quick, may I?
Yes, you may.
Yes, absolutely right. I mean, the temples are very early on the habit of lending money on credit. But what I meant was something new in the 4th century. It's the state that the aphorme in Athens, which Xenophon proposes, the aphorme, the startup it is the state that manages that that arrangement. Whereas in the other cases, it is the temples, right?
I suspect there may not be as much difference as all that between the two.
No, absolutely no.
I see again.
Excuse me, just to intervene to make this clear, very important is who handled this case at Rhamnus, John. Were they simply the priests of the local temple, of administrators of the finances of the local temple?
The only evidence of date we have, I think, is a demarc. Name of a demarc. Let me get it from the IG one.
I think also Veronique is trying to jump in on this point.
Well, we may be wiser with Veronique's help.
Yeah.
Please.
If I may, of course, the right question, Kostas, you're right. The question is, who are the people? Because there is, not only in Rhamnos, but all the time there is a permeability between the methods of the temples and the methods of the bankers. And of course, Demosthenes is a good example of that in comparison with Rhamnos or other one. But the people were the same. Who were the administrators of the temple, citizens having an experience from the boule, from the ecclesia, and the questions that were discussed in the boule or in the ecclesia were also economic and financial ones. How do you manage a contract? What are the right way to create a loan and so on? So this experience, I mean, was very much built in the institutional framework of the city, in the boule, in the ecclesia, and of course there was some consequences of this in the administration of the temples, but also in private activities. And the contrary is true also. I mean, a banker or a trader had an experience that was also useful in the public sphere. So I think that we have to emphasize much more this permeability and the capacity of the citizens to be involved in administrative and financial activities. Recently, a book of Paulin Ismar emphasized the role of the slave, public slaves, as competent actors of the administration and financial administration especially. But there are a lot of very good idea and analysis in this book. But I completely disagree with the idea that the competencies, the financial competencies, were only on the sphere of the public slaves. Because it's evident that all these competencies were circulating through the institution and through the capacity of the citizens to be private actors of the finances and also public actors of the administration of the finances of cities and sanctuaries. So I think that in a more general, in a more broader approach, this permeability is a very important point.
Thank you, Veronique. I think that your paper gains in perspective through these remarks, Katerina. Any other? Christina, please help me. Who is the next?
See John and Veronique, their hands up, but I think that's from before. I don't see any other raised hands or questions in the chat.
There is no other question left. My only question would be then, just at the end, Katerina, you have said that we have no evidence on taxation imposed by the Antigonids, or am I mistaken? I did not understand you correctly.
No.
I would like only to bring this into the proper relation with the evidence of Livius that the Romans lowered the taxation when they came to Macedonia. How should we understand that?
Right, the famous Livy. It's just that they, I'm trying to figure out, I presume that had to do with an appropriation of the mines, hadn't it? As far as
Yes.
Was basically the mines were to be
in conjunction with that, and it is mentioned. Well, it was presented as a positive gesture of the new rulers in the four Merides. We have lowered your taxation. They should be able to convince that this was a real measure.
I presume that would have to do with the imposition, the possible imposition by Philip V of
Okay. Okay. But then one should not be so general in this claim that there was no taxation of the Antigones. I would be very careful in that. Okay, only this remark.
I see Paschalis has his hands up.
Well, we have another Macedonian specialist here, many more, but Paschalis is one.
We can't hear you, Paschalis. You're muted.
You are mute. Please get your voice back.
Πασχάλη, σου έκλεισε το μικρόφωνο. Προσπάθησε να το ανοίξεις πάλι, γιατί δεν δούλευε φαίνεται πριν. Μήπως έχεις κλείσει το κεντρικό μικρόφωνο του υπολογιστή?
I think we'll leave it at that. I'm really sorry, the technical difficulties. Thank you very much, Katerina. I think we're running out of time and we have a 10-minute break before Manuela's paper. So we'll all come back at 5:15, whether that is 5:15 Greek time, 4:15 Central European time, or 3:15 UK time. So we'll see you in about 13 minutes. Thank you, Katerina. Okay, I think we're ready to start the final paper of this conference before John Davies' response that will mark the end of the conference. I want to share some of the comments before that. This has been, so far in my experience, a fantastic discussion considering the unprecedented means in which we're all communicating. I'm talking about Zoom, which is relatively new for most of us. It's a new experience in the past 6 months. So extra congratulations to the organizers for making everything happen. It's a great pleasure indeed to introduce Manuela Mari, a good friend of mine, who is an associate professor at the University of Bari. Manuela, of course, has written widely on a huge range of subjects, from epigraphy to the Macedonians, to religion, to sanctuaries, to historiography. And she's here very appropriately to talk to us about religious change. Manuela.
Thank you. Thank you, Christy. I'll try, first of all, to share my screen. I think it's now working. I hope so, at least. Okay. First of all, I would like to thank Katerina Panagopoulou and Kostas Vlasopoulos for inviting me to this conference and giving me the opportunity to pay homage to one of the greatest scholars of ancient Greek history ever. It's a pity not being physically together, but as Christy just said, this new experience has worked very well so far. To John Davies, I would like to express one more time my admiration, affection, and respect. I think that Christy could probably recognize the location of this photo. She was there also, and she probably has some wonderful pictures of us all while dancing, including John himself. To be more serious, I thank John for everything I have learned from him over the years and for his friendship and support. The topic that Katerina and Kostas have invited me to discuss, religious change in Greek history, a very difficult task, as you may imagine, requires a few premises, which I hope won't sound too trivial, at least. I will start by remarking that religion and religious are essentially modern concepts. When using them, we naturally think of a very specific field of human behavior, which in our minds is separate from any other. But such an idea of religion is absent in pre-modern societies. Greek language, with its typical vagueness, usually employed the adjective hieros, sacred, and related words in order to describe a wide spectrum of concepts related to what we call religion, that is, cults and cult places, sacred objects, sacrifices, and rites. So, for example, the neuter adjective hieron can indicate both a sanctuary and a rite, and the plural ta hiera may also refer to religious affairs, meaning, for example, a specific agenda item in a civic assembly's meeting. By a largely shared convention, we employ the words religion and religious in order to cover the extremely wide conceptual area corresponding to Greek hieron, hiera. But it is important to keep in mind that no single Greek word corresponds to our religion, just because religion was not a specific and separate sphere of human life. Religion was everywhere, so to say, in both the private and public lives of individuals, in the entire life of the community. To quote Robert Parker's words, there was an embeddedness of religion within the city. A second remark. Ancient Greek cults and the beliefs and norms associated with them seem characterized by a strong attachment to tradition. And such a character is often explicitly affirmed. Ritual acts and norms were frequently described as being based on ancestral customs, patroa hiera, patroa nomima. In the long and detailed text of the sacred law on the mysteries of Andania in Messenia, a text to which I'll return later, the final sentence explicitly prohibits any attempt at changing or altering its norms in the future. This suggests to me a clarifying and wider remark. In ancient Greece, theoretically at least, traditionalism is not an exclusive feature of religious thinking and behavior. Véronique Shankowski has recalled such a fact in her paper this morning. On the contrary, respectful references to allegedly traditional or ancestral norms dominate the social and political discourse, and so to say, public life as a whole. Many secular decrees enacted by Greek cities include entrenchment clauses quite similar to the final sentence of the sacred law of Andania. And in classical and Hellenistic Athens, politicians who suggested institutional reforms were always exposed to the charge of kataliusis tudemu, assault on democracy. The analogy between the entrenchment clauses in sacred laws and in the civic laws has been recently recalled by Edward Harris in an article on Kernos in 2015. We may say, therefore, that religious traditionalism is only a part of a much broader Greek attitude towards change and innovation. A good citizen was one who, among other things, respected a number of traditional norms and customs, which also included religious traditions and old customs. We find a meaningful example of such a conception, e contrario at least, in the description of the bad citizen Leocrates by Lycurgus. The orator insists on impiety as a typical feature of traitors. At the public level, all attempts at introducing new gods, altering cult traditions and norms, building new sanctuaries, adding new ceremonies to pre-existing festivals, and so on, were extremely delicate acts, always exposed to severe criticism or even formal charges. The rich amount of literary evidence on the crime of impiety in classical and Hellenistic Athens clearly attests to a largely shared and authentic sensitivity towards this topic. The epigraphic evidence, in particular, confirms that innovations in these fields had to undergo a complex procedure in a monarchical state no less than in democratic cities. I'll limit myself to make a short reference to two examples. On the left side of the screen, a part of the text of the Athenian reform of the annual Panathenaia in 330s, and on the right side of the screen, the intervention of the Macedonian king Philip V on the correct dressing of the hunters of Heracles. I will come back to the second text later. At the same time, we should keep in mind that polytheism, by its very nature, inclines towards changes and is open to foreign gods and new cults. The pantheon of any Greek city flexibly accepted new gods, in some cases identifying or even merging them with the old ones, and the specific functions attributed to each deity considerably changed from one place to another or in the same place over time. Robin Osborne this morning drew our attention on the different conception of the distribution of supernatural powers as possibly reflected in material culture. And this is another example of this natural flexibility and trend to the natural changes in any polytheistic religion. This leads me to a final introductory and dual remark, so to say. Although I'm drawing my examples from very different contexts, places, and periods, the local dimension is the ideal focus, if not the only one, for correctly studying Greek religion. On the other hand, the embeddedness of religion within the city and the nature and contents of our sources necessarily restrict my treatment of religious change to the public aspects of religion. That is, linguistic conventions are inevitable, to polis religion. I don't want to come back to the debate on what should be defined as polis religion. Anyway, ancient authors are mainly interested in cults, sanctuaries, and religious activities as far as they are essential elements of public life and communal values, rather than as a part of individual daily life. Literary sources frequently, if not exclusively, note changes in local cults in association with important events that affected a community, such as, for example, traumatic war experiences or dramatic changes in external relationships. And modern scholars often approach in the same way sacred laws, or to quote Harris, the title of the recent Harris I already made a reference to, regulations about religious matters, the kind of epigraphic evidence arguably most useful to the study of religious change, although, as we will see, very ambiguous on this specific side. Modern scholars, as a matter of fact, often place sacred law in direct relation with important historical events known from other sources or even hypothetical. Interpretations of this kind are perhaps not always needed or advisable, and in any case, they are often speculative, as most sacred laws simply list norms without highlighting their innovative nature. Likely enough, there are a few exceptions which offer precious material for our topic. In particular, I'll come back in the final part of my paper on the already mentioned regulation on the mysteries of Andania. With all due caution and with a necessarily limited scope, I'll try to schematically reconstruct from a few selected examples taken from both literary and epigraphic sources some general patterns of the ways in which ancient Greeks negotiated religious changes and their effects on society. A good starting point may be represented by the so-called polyadic deity, namely the most visible, at least, symbol of the identity of a Greek polis. Its main function was allegedly protecting a community from any danger of natural or human origin, infertility, famine, plagues, natural disasters, wars and related pillages, and any other war damages. It is not always possible to demonstrate on the basis of the available sources that, or to what extent, the occurrence of such negative circumstances directly affected the popularity of a polyadic deity and by consequence influenced changes in its cult. For example, as far as Hellenistic Athens is concerned, John Michelson suggested some years ago that the popularity of Athena and her cult on the Acropolis was heavily damaged by Demetrius the Besieger's and Lachares' offenses against the goddess, her cult, and her wealth. While on the other hand, Robert Parker and other scholars have questioned this reconstruction, which is certainly very difficult to prove on archaeological grounds. On the other hand, there is no doubt that the most meaningful innovation in Greek religion in Hellenistic times, that is the ruler cult, was, so to say, a challenge to traditional cult of the polyadic deities, and at the same time, a response to the community's need for tangible help and protection. And Athens itself often showed such an attitude towards living deities. The famous Ithyphallic hymn performed by the Athenians in 291 in order to celebrate the return of Demetrius the Besieger and his wife Lanassa from Kerkyra goes as far as setting the king god against the traditional gods, who are perceived as remote and ineffective. And this has been convincingly interpreted by Angelos Kaniotis, among others, as reliable evidence of the spirit of the age, rather than an example of mere flattery and political expediency. Some information on the evolution of a local pantheon and on how it was affected by the community's inner or external affairs on it is available in the case of colonies, apoikiai, and their relationship with mother cities. Such a relationship traditionally included the sharing of institutions and traditional habits, and the pantheon of a colony was inspired from the start, at least partly, by that of the mother city. We have plenty of epigraphic evidence on this, and a famous passage by Thucydides on Himera, about which Thucydides stressed the mixed character of the dialect of a colony, which was a mixed one, founded by both Ionian-speaking Chalcidians from Zankle and Doric Syracusans. And Thucydides stressed the fact that the dialect was mixed, while among the nomima, the institutions, the Chalcidian ones prevailed. The generic nomima almost certainly refers also to religious habits, but we are not sure about that. On the other hand, as Irad Malkin has remarked, the Oikis cult, symbolizing the colony's relationship with the mother city, is at the same time also the first autonomous cult of the new city. And we have a number of references in our sources, especially to the most recent colonies. I simply quote in passing the very famous example of Amphipolis, which decided to destroy all monuments, making reference to the original founder Hagnon, when choosing Brasidas as its new founder and savior. And the second example from the same period, Turi, another Athenian colony, which only 10 years after its foundation was authorized by Delphic Apollo to consider the god himself as its founder. And we can easily suppose that here, as in Amphipolis, the real founder's memory was at the same time obliterated. As for the Hellenistic new cities founded in the territories that were once part of Alexander's empire, the evolution of the local pantheon apparently did not follow a single pattern. In these cities, the origin of the settlers was mixed even more than in archaic and classical colonies. And this led to the creation of a particularly flexible and independent pantheon. In Ai-Khanum, in modern Afghanistan, probably Alexandria on the Oxus, the archaeological and epigraphic evidence shows the existence of the traditional Oikist cult. A heron in the city center was dedicated to the founder Kineas, following a custom already known to Pindar and also adopted by Ptolemy with Alexander's body in Alexandria in Egypt. The same usually happened in pre-existent cities which were refounded and received a new name, in most cases that of a king or a member of royal family. The city's renaming was accompanied by the introduction of the cult of the king Oikist and of the related festivals, sacrifices, and priests. A good example is provided by Sicyon, which became Demetrias in 303 in honor of, again, Demetrius the Besieger. And such developments probably affected also the inner hierarchy of local deities and cults, but direct evidence of such phenomena is extremely difficult to find. Typically enough, our sources record only the innovation and do not pay attention to the routine. But the pattern was not always the same, and unlike Ai-Khanum, many newly founded cities show no trace of the traditional Oikist cult. In cases where a rich archaeological and epigraphic evidence is available, I mean for the new Hellenistic cities, such a silence seems not merely accidental and is therefore meaningful, of a variety of behaviors at least. Apparently, the always delicate decision to modify the pantheon and cult habits in a pre-existing town or in a katoikia when it became a polis depended on the local situation or on the king's will when he was directly involved in the process. It is not surprising that a king might decide to intervene also in this field when status changes, syncretisms, or refoundations of towns occurred. We see it in Antigonus the One-Eyed's attempt at promoting a syncretism between the cities of Teos and Lebedos in Asia Minor, which in the end failed, as the king's letters on that subject deal specifically, among other things, also with the participation of the inhabitants of both cities in the festival of the Paeonia. Due to the growing number of epigraphic testimonia from a wide geographical area, the Hellenistic period is a privileged observation post also on the development of civic festivals over time and on their significance for local identities. A well-attested example is provided by those festivals originally founded as celebrations mainly of military successes upon the initiative of the king, or of some other party seeking to please him, festivals that later became a regular feature of a city's festive calendar. This probably happened in Tyre, which Alexander conquered in 332 after a hard siege. Here, the king established games in honor of Heracles, which are known to us both from literary and epigraphic evidence, and both from literary and epigraphic evidence, we know that Heraclea were celebrated in Tyre long afterwards. We may interpret these later issues as a legacy of Alexander's initiative and a way to commemorate an event which deeply marked local history and memory. In many other cases, instead, the innovations did not last for long. This was the case with many practical features of the Hellenistic ruler cult. Festivals, sacrifices, or games connected to it were in many cases obliterated or adapted to changes in a city's external relationships. The literary tradition on Alexander is also a good illustration of how traditional cults and festivals could adapt themselves to very peculiar external conditions. A festival could easily break from its traditional location when it was organized not in a civic framework, but by a traveling army. I quote here an example from the tradition on Alexander, but there is also something similar in Xenophon's Anabasis about a, so to say, traveling issue of the Arcadian Leucaia celebrated during the expedition of the 10,000. A precise limit to the possibility of modifying a festive calendar, moving a traditional festival to an unusual location, or changing the characters of the festival itself, however, did exist and was clearly perceived. The cycle, the periodos, of the 4 traditional crown games, which we call Panhellenic festivals, was apparently a protected area, perhaps because its composition and program had been established already in the Archaic period in the early 6th century. In a highly influential paper, John Davies himself has reconstructed this early development and suggested plausible reasons for the geographical composition of the periodos. Such a system, based on 4 fixed locations, provided central Greece and northern Peloponnese, the Greece of the Polis, with, I quote John, both with high-frequency, small, rich periodic markets and low-frequency, long-range markets. And this economic and geographic rationale remained valid well into the Roman period. As a consequence, in spite of the emergence of an enormous number of crown festivals throughout the Hellenistic world, the hierarchical preeminence, theoretical at least, of the 4 games of the periodos remained untouched. And it is no chance that those 4 festivals were particularly conservative as far as their program, main characters, and location were concerned. So, according to Plutarch, Demetrius the Besieger's decision to organize the Pythian Games in Athens in 290, due to the Aetolian control of Delphi, was perceived as shocking. There is some kind of literary topos about the tyrannical behavior of Demetrius in this episode, but significantly, ancient descriptions of Nero's tour of Greece are equally influenced by the same tyrannical topoi, still very valid. The emperor is portrayed by Suetonius as a violator both of the regular quadriennial calendar of the games and of the traditional program of the Olympic festival, which still at the time was apparently limited to athletic and equestrian games. Apart from the particularly delicate case of Panhellenic Games, however, anyone who attempted to introduce a religious reform or revolution had to follow the appropriate procedure to avoid negative reactions, legitimizing the change by appealing to a true or alleged tradition and/or obtaining some kind of supernatural authorization, usually an oracular response. One of these procedures, or both, were followed when a community attempted at modifying more or less deeply cult practices, rites, priesthoods, at introducing new gods and sacrifices, at allowing any secular use of previously sacred lands and properties, and so on. So different passages of the Athenian decree on the first fruits to Eleusis, dated to the 430s, recall the necessity for the Athenians and the other Greeks to follow on that matter both an allegedly traditional custom and a Delphic oracle. Harris, again, in his article, makes reference to this document too as a way to explain the way in which city-states appealed to the oracle of Delphi in order to confer authority to their legislation. Such an insistence on the tradition and on the oracle probably conceals and tries to make acceptable the fact that some new rules were now introduced. Here we have a clear example of the ways in which sacred laws usually avoided to declare explicitly the novelty of the rules included in them. On the basis of the ancient evidence on Delphic responses, and more particularly of the epigraphic testimonia, we may also safely conclude that the need to regulate and legitimize religious changes is the most frequently attested reason for consulting Delphic Apollo. And I could quote a number of occasions in which this is attested, by the time is running. So I go to my final example, that the long and detailed regulation of the mysteries of Andania, which is in particular also because in this case, the authority, which is always usually recognized to Delphic Apollo in religious changes, probably was in this case attributed to a local oracle. This long regulation, which I have already referred to, dating, according to most scholars, to the early 5th century BC, among many other matters, which it is impossible to address here, clearly alludes to the leading role of a man called Mnasistratus and of his family as far as the cult and its reform were concerned. The text records a phase in the history of the cult in which Mnasistratos Genos, which had probably been performing traditional priestly functions for a long time, handed over a part of its prerogatives while keeping some privileges. You have here two relevant parts of the text. In the first one, the norm about the transferal of the Biblia, of the sacred books, and I shall come back to this before, to the new appointed priests in charge with the ritual, while the second passage is about the procession and about the leading role that Mnasistratos and his family have to keep in this part of the ritual. A second inscription, which you find in the third one in the screen, which is only fragmentally preserved, describes Mnasistratus as a hierophantes and records his consultation of an oracle, very probably, as I said, not the Delphic oracle, but that of Apollo Pythaeus in Argos. It is impossible to reconstruct the details of the reform, and only the beginning of the oracular response is preserved. But a distinction appears between the apparent preservation of the traditional custom in performing sacrifices, which should be offered catata patria on the one hand, and the reform of the mysteries on the other, which is the specific object of the oracular response given to Mnasistratus, and whose details are exposed in the other and very long inscription. If we had to the epigraphic material the controversial and not always clear references to the mysteries of Andania in the fourth book of Pausanias' description of Greece, we may at least get a glimpse of the historical development of Greek local cult. A fundamental step in that history, a long time before Mnasistratus' intervention, was represented by Epaminondas' activities in the Peloponnese after the Theban success over the Spartans at Leuctra, culminating in the foundation of the city of Messene. Whatever it may be the historical value of Pausanias' allusion to the events in the age of Epaminondas, it is interesting to stress that there is a similarity between these two passages. Pausanias makes a reference to some sacred texts discovered or rediscovered at the time of Epaminondas and directly leading to the foundation of Messene. At the time of Mnasistratus, a key element of the reform, as we have already seen, is again the handover of a box containing books, sacred books, so to say, from Mnasistratus to the priests who were entrusted with the organization of the mysteries from then on. Now, the complex evidence on the mysteries of Andania clearly shows something that for most Greek religious practices we know of is only hypothetical. In other words, and in spite of their apparent ultra-conservatism, every Greek cult had its own history, went through changes over time, and could take on different meanings for a community and its sense of identity. While normally, and at least theoretically, Greek religious practices withstood changes and made a show of their faithfulness to a well-established tradition, changes in religion, as in anything else, inevitably occurred. Such changes were sometimes due to pretty secular reasons, which often remained unknown to us. The search for a balance between these two opposite trends in the Greek world took often the form of a consultation of oracles. But, as we have just seen in the case of the mysteries of Andania, in some cases a delicate process of religious change could also be justified by referring to, so to say, a sacred bibliography, which unfortunately is almost entirely unknown to us. In other cases, some kind of scholarly research was required or could be implied. A text which I have already briefly mentioned, the letter of a local officer to the sanctuary of Heracles in Demetrias, reveals a faded and fascinating trace of such processes. The letter makes an explicit reference to a diagramma by the Macedonian king Philip V concerning new rules on the correct dressing of the hunters of Heracles, enacted, I quote, on the basis of the king's inquiry on this matter, or on the inquiry on this matter, the results of which are displayed by the king, Kataten historia neno Basileus eisegeita peritu pragmatos. It is just a detail, and yet it is enough to show that even the Macedonian king, the supreme authority of the state in matter of legislation, before changing an apparently minor detail in the practicalities of a cult, had to find a historical basis and justification for his act. In other words, the only safe way to confront the future and the inevitable changes it brought was basing oneself on the past, its models and its lessons. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Manuela. I particularly enjoyed the very broad range and use of examples. You really covered pretty much the entire Greek world, different localities, different centers. This was truly impressive. So I'll open the floor to questions. Please raise your hand. Professor Buraselis.
Well, I do not wish to misuse my chairman's rights. If someone else wishes to speak first, I would give him here my place.
We have no raised hands, so I think you can.
Well, I very much liked your presentation, Manuela. Let me say that it was a really fine example of synthesis on a partial subject. You may understand that I was especially intrigued, I would say, by your remarks on the ruler cult as a change in itself inside Hellenistic religion, and especially in respect to its connections with already established cults. I have been somehow busy myself with this sub-problem, trying to see how the ruler cult tried to accommodate itself inside or beside the traditional religion. I may remind you that I have been puzzled how to name especially festivals that existed already before the time of the big kings and were later renamed. And I have coined the term, if you like, appended festivals. Heraclea, who are also Antigone or Antioche and so on. More intriguing perhaps, and more interesting in my respect, is the case where we have the foundation of cities, where a king wishes somehow not to project his personality exclusively to the foreground, but prefers to appear as a sort of synoikist. This is very interesting, and we find it in Alexandria. We find it also, this is also very interesting in Antiochia itself, where Seleucus is the one who does decide where the new city should be built, but this is traced back to divine interventions and signs. Exactly there, I would say, is where we could recognize how intricate and how refined the interconnection between traditional religion and the new religion of the ruler cults lies. And perhaps this is a fine example in your armor on this point. Also, I would like to say that your expression, I liked it, that polytheism by its nature tends to changes, is correct, because a polytheism, and with the background of Greek polytheism, is not a completed whole. It leaves spaces open for complements. And in so far, we could say that religious change is embedded in the idea of Greek religion. It is justified a priori, if you like. Well, just these ideas as initiatives for further thought for you and for us all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Buraselis. As far as ruler cult is involved, it has been remarked many times that ruler cult directly follows the example of traditional cults. I discussed the very famous text of the Ithyphallic hymn to Demetrius the Besieger, but the very fact that a Ithyphallic hymn was dedicated to Demetrius in order to stage, so to say, his similarity to Dionysus is striking, and we have a number of varied manifestations of this this trend. For example, even there are different levels, as you suggested. In some cases, the kings as new deities become Sunai theoi of traditional gods. In other cases, as you mentioned, a traditional festival received a new name, like the Demetriae, the Dionysic festival in Athens, which apparently, according to Plutarch, received also the name of Demetriae, and so on. It is a multifarious phenomenon, but thank you. As far as for the nature of the polytheism, of course, I was simply quoting a famous description of the polytheism in Robert Parker's book on polytheism, the fact that polytheism is naturally open to changes, but at the same time, I have tried to show the ways in which such changes should be negotiated, so to say.
Thank you. We have a series of questions. Kostas wants to ask a question, and then it's Andre, and then Irene Salvo from the attendees. So we'll start with Kostas.
Yes, thank you, Manuela. I think there are, I'll start with a comment. I think there are two aspects of your paper that were really very important. And the first is its focus on agency. Who does what for change to happen? You put a lot of emphasis on that. The second is about reactions to change. You focused quite a lot about how people legitimize change, how people react to change. Originally, when we were discussing with Katerina what topics to include in this conference, one of the topics was reactions to change. In the end, we dropped it, but I think your paper shows quite well why the rest of us should think more about this particular aspect of the topic. Now comes to my question, which is about the big picture. The sort of discussion I tried to frame around structural and conjunctural. Once upon a time, the narrative about Greek religion was, yeah, okay, in the beginning, Greek religion was ritualistic, but then people started to have spiritual quests, and the sophists criticized Greek religion, and those Oriental cults came as well. So paganism was in crisis, and thank God the Christians came and they sorted everything out. Or what a tragedy, the Christians came, and that was the end of rationalism. After the Second World War, gradually that kind of narrative went away. And that was a good thing. But what substituted it was effectively a history, a study without history, basically. If you put aside Robert Parker's books, which have the word history in their title, the vast majority of studies about Greek religion do not have the word history in their titles. So the question is, how do you think about it? Should we approach the religious change as basically more or less a structure that appears, let's say, around 800 or a bit after that, and then yes, there are changes in this cult and the other cult, cults introduce changes in how they take place, but more or less it's a relatively stable structure until whatever point one wants to take it? Or is it a bit more complicated than that? Final thing, you put a lot of emphasis on the impact of outside factors on religion, politics, and so on and so forth. I'd like to hear whether you think, I think you're absolutely right that we think of religion as a separate field. Greeks didn't, and it didn't work like that. Does that mean that there is little which is religious in itself when we talk about religious change in the ancient Greek world? Or not? I know it's a lot, so pick whatever you want to comment on.
No, well, you're right. If I take my example more particularly from a field which I know more than others, that is the field of the ruler cult in Hellenistic times. It fits very well with your comments about the ways in which modern conceptions about the history and the historical development of Greek religion have changed over time. That is, for a long time, the ruler cult was seen and judged as an example of the decline of the authentic, so to say, religious feeling of the Greeks. Later on, any religious consideration was set apart, and the ruler cult was exclusively judged and analyzed on the basis of its political effects. Now, in quoting Robert Parker's word, that religious was not a separate field, but something completely embedded in the other aspects of civic life, I was trying to say that, of course, for us, it is important to separate aspects because it is a part of our critical effort to evaluate historical phenomena. But on the other hand, as historical phenomena, we have to consider that political and religious sides of a phenomenon must be seen at the same time. So I really think with Angelos Chaniotis that the Ithiphallic hymn to Demetrios Poliorketes, which definitely was an act of political flattery, so to say, or an act a way of making, of coming to terms with Demetrius' power by the Athenians, was at the same time an authentic expression of religious feeling, because the main function attributed to a deity, to the Poliadic deity, was protecting the city from its enemies, from any danger, etc. Now, Demetrius or any other powerful king had exactly that power, and so it was appropriate to address him in that way. So I don't think that religious the religious sphere can be separated in our analysis, if I have expressed what I think. But thank you for your remark, of course.
Andre?
Yes. Thank you very much for this very rich cinematic paper. And I entirely agree what you have just said about the rural cult. And this is the point I would like to make. I think what permitted to Christian Habich to interpret the rural cult as the entirely politic phenomenon was that he showed in a very convincing way that it was something natural for the Greeks to recognize a divine nature of a human act. So the rural cult, as far as the cases he studied was concerned, was not going out of the traditional religion in the sense that it didn't change anything in the perception of the person of the king. Because the people just recognized by their vote that they, how to say, experience some kind of divine power embedded in the act of this particular king on this particular occasion. And which is what is new and what we have just stressed in a very convincing way in Ithiphallicus is that the Athenians recognize a different status of the person of Demetrius Poliorketes, and not only a status of this particular act he has committed, because they don't allude to any particular act. And now we have this extremely interesting decree from Aegean, which is a perfect parallel to Ithiphallicus, in which the citizens of Aegean say that Seleucus and Antiochus were the Epiphanentes, the gods who appeared in their city, and it is not a cultic title or epithets used in a specific cult which is voted for them, but it is a recognition of their general quality. And this is something, and it is a very a very profound change, which maybe was limited to some particular cities, but it is a completely new phenomenon and a very important one.
Yes, this is quite right. But at the same time, as you know, Abich's book was also an important step in recognizing in this field too the fact that even the ruler cult was not a completely new phenomenon, but it has a very strong basis in different kind of let's call them isotheoitimai, or whatever we may call them, paid to human beings already before the Hellenistic period. Still in the age of Alexander, we have a number of different aspects of this way of honoring human beings coexisting. Alexander was honored as the dead founder of Alexandria in a very typical and traditional way, so to say. And at the same time, we have a number of indications that he was already worshipped in his lifetime. So yes, things were changing in a number of ways, but still starting from very long-ranging roots.
Just one minor point, but in our analysis, we have to distinguish the situation in which a city vote Celtic honors for a foreign king, and the situation quoted by Kostas Buraselis of cities which were founded by some kings and in which we have cults. Those origins can be maybe on the side of this particular king, or we have some kind of dynastic cult in some Seleucid cities, and this is something different.
Yes, yes.
Yes.
Irene Salvo from the attendees would like to speak, if Kostas or Katerina can allow that.
Yeah.
Irene?
Hi. So first of all, I'd like to thank warmly the organizers, because I feel for you that, you know, the conference couldn't take place in Crete, but I'm enjoying very much your papers and the discussion. So really a big thank to the organizers, to John Davies, and to all the speakers. So although I do hope that in the near future we can go back to face-to-face conferences. Anyway, on religious change, thank you very much for your brilliant paper. My question is about, you know, more recently, we have studied ancient religion from a perspective of a personal religion, or like the lived ancient religion from your Rübke project. So from this perspective, can we apply the category of change to the level of the individual and to belief? So how individual belief were changing, also in relation to monuments and inscription. For example, I'm thinking about the Yamata from Epidaurus, and how the text and the stones, one of the function was also to persuade or to increase the beliefs in the power of the god. So yeah, it's probably a comment related also to what Kostas was saying before about the agency. So who does what to make change happens, but also how religious change can happen at an individual level. Thank you.
Yes, of course, for a comprehensive discussion of religious change, we should take also this aspect into account. But as I said, it is, of course, much more difficult to catch it in the available sources, because both the nature of the epigraphic text, of course, we have a number of private dedications, and you correctly mentioned the Yamata, which are all expressions of private or individual beliefs. It is, of course, more difficult to catch in this kind of documentation general changes or maybe in this specific field, I was thinking about it this morning in listening to Robin Osborne's paper, maybe in this specific feature, material culture can give us more material and more suggestion, more fuel for such a discussion. But at the same time, is something much more hypothetical because it's you know, the literary sources give not so many indications on this field, are less interested in the private side of the religious phenomenon than on the public side, so to say. But yes, of course, for a comprehensive treatment of the subject, we should add something on this point. And thank you for the suggestion.
I see Paschalis has his hand raised.
Thank you, Manuela. Can you hear me? Problem solved. Thank you for bringing out so vividly the intertwinement of tradition and innovation in the religious sphere. I sometimes wonder if we could not put this dialectic relationship in even more provocative terms. I often feel that even in religious, that tradition is rarely absent from religious innovation. When a new god is introduced to a community, this god often comes with his or her own baggage, with his own tradition. And the fact that it is a foreign tradition and often a dazzling, exotic tradition that requires its own experts is part of its allure. So the sense of tradition is there. Even in cultic creations, how to put it, created out of thin air, as in some associative cults of hybrid cultic figures in later periods, the sense of tradition is not absent and takes the form of the veneration of the founder of the cult and the respect and veneration of past members of the cult. So it seems as if in change, and there is, as you quite well put it, perpetual change in all aspects of religion, some sense of tradition is always meant to be there.
Yes, I absolutely agree. And I may add, still in the footsteps of Veronique Shankowski in her paper of this morning, that this is something crucial, not only to the language of religion in Greek culture, but to the political discourse as well, to the public discourse as well. Any reform must be presented or described as a return to tradition. Veronique quoted a few examples from the epigraphic record this morning, but we may add from the literary evidence the famous case of Cleomenes III, the most revolutionary king in the history of Peloponnese, according to Polybius and others, who apparently presented his own reforms as a return to Lycurgus, to the true legislation of Lycurgus. So I think this is a major aspect of Greek way to look at changes. In order to accept changes should have something traditional. This is something I tried to explain, but yes, the same could be said for a number of aspects of Greek society, I think.
Do we have any other questions? We still have some minutes left. Well, I want to ask something if I can, since no one else is raising their hands. I was struck by Corinne Bonnet's use of the word translation for describing, I think, what you are describing, the adaptability of the Greek polytheistic system. So she said the Greek polytheism is essentially a system of translations that allows for movement between different systems and adaptation. So that is a slightly different focus on what you describe as change, and it's more about adaptability. Do you think there is a fundamental difference here?
No, I think it is a part of the general phenomenon of change. I mean, the one Corinne Bonnet rendered as such is so to say, a structural element of Greek religion. That is the fact that it was open to adopt new cults, to adopt new deities, etc. Simply translating them into its own language. But there are a number of other possible changes I've tried to highlight. For example, the different developments of the cult rendered to human being, which is something that changes over time. This is an example. Or simply the possibility of changing a local cult, or of adding new elements to an already established cult. This is not a translation, but this is another aspect of a changing of a general aptitude to changes. So yes, it is a very useful concept, but I think that we have to be open to a wider spectrum of possible changes in Greek religion.
Okay, thank you. I see no other raised hands, at which point I think we need to thank Manuela very warmly for an excellent paper and very stimulating discussion. And I think we're having a 15-minute break, and we're coming back at past to listen to John's final remarks, to which we all really eagerly anticipate. Thank you. So I'll see you all in 15 minutes.
Okay. John?
Yes.
You are listening to us?
Yes.
Well, I think we are all on our screens again. We have heard many interesting things in this conference. And now we have the final response. It is like keeping a balance, or giving a balance of what has preceded, and who else could do this better than the person to the honor of whom the whole thing has been organized. John, please be merciless in your conclusions. Thank you.
I would not at all wish to be merciless in my conclusions, but I don't want to be too formal in giving this response, because it would be inconsistent with the wonderful informal camaraderie which, to my pleasure, has characterized all our sessions in spite of the logistical difficulties. But it is only proper to begin with some formality. That's because it's both a privilege and a responsibility to be performing this task of giving the final address to this conference. But for me, as its honorand, one part of that task is a particular pleasure, and that is to start by making 4 expressions of thanks on behalf, not just of myself, but of all of us. They're in no order of rank, they're all primary. The first is, excuse me a moment, the first is to thank the University of Crete and its academic and support staff for hosting this event, and especially for doing so and managing it so efficiently and willingly in the current dispiriting circumstances. It has been a real source of comfort to have been able to see and greet so many friends and colleagues during these last 3 days. We may not have been able to touch or embrace each other, or to enjoy the atmosphere of the friendly city of Rethymno, but we have been able to renew or enhance relationships, or to create new ones. And that matters, because academics are social animals too. Our second vote of thanks must go to the sponsor of this conference. Without Mr. Martinos's initiative and encouragement and financial support, we would not be meeting at all, nor, I suspect, might we necessarily have settled upon what has proved to be a most stimulating theme. It has been all the more enlightening an occasion for that very reason, because we academic historians of antiquity only exist because sufficient members of the public are interested in the remote past, and therefore also are interested in what we do and say and to discover about it. And we have a corresponding obligation to report back and to respect and foster that public interest. Mr. Martinos, if you are listening, please accept our very grateful thanks. Thirdly, we, in the plural, must thank all the writers and presenters of papers. I do so on my own behalf, obviously, because I have learnt much from your papers and remarks in discussion, as one always does in a conference. But I also do so in a more collective and impersonal mode, saluting all the efforts which you have all made to respond so warmly and interestingly to a specific challenge, and thereby to contribute to a worthy joint enterprise. And I hope I may add, on behalf of the native English speakers here present, if I exercise the privilege of age for a moment and express our gratitude and admiration to all our colleagues who have presented and discussed their papers so fluently and confidently in a foreign lingua franca. To be able to do so is a major accomplishment which reflects great credit on education systems and professional training, but also on personal effort. On our behalf, thank you. Finally, we all owe a huge debt to Katerina and Kostas, alike for their initiative and energy in organizing and reorganizing the conference in nightmarish conditions, as well as for their own academic contributions to it. And to their names, I should like to add, on behalf of all of us, that of Aris Kitonakis, whose skills as electronic disc jockey have been exemplary. Those of us who have organized conferences, and I expect that is probably most of us, are very well aware of how stressful the task can be. This one will have been to a very high degree. And to speak very briefly and inadequately, I owe Katerina and Kostas my own deep personal debt. They have been and are long-standing personal friends, and to pay me the compliment of organizing this conference is a gesture beyond price. The title on this program for this final contribution is simply Response. I have at most 30 minutes. We are all probably tired, and at least in Greece, and I dare say elsewhere, the thought of a glass of wine followed by supper will be becoming very attractive. I cannot therefore attempt to inflict on you the sort of full dress critique and recombination of themes which I have been known to provide on similar previous occasions. I reckoned it was much better instead simply to enjoy being an aged and benevolent dinosaur, now beginning my 62nd year of being a historian of antiquity, heaven help us, and to sit back and listen with pleasure and admiration to the ways in which other, and some much younger, colleagues and friends are taking the opportunities and the agendas of ancient Greek history forwards. So, to begin with, 3 brief comments by way of a praeteritio. The first is, with, I may say, slight regret, to note that by general tacit consent, this has been a colloquium not so much about the Aegean explicitly as about ancient Greece in general. The regret being that there is still, therefore, still to be written as a continuation of Oliver Dickinson's The Aegean from Bronze Age to Iron Age, a book which deals with the whole of the Aegean basin itself and its immediate hinterland, as distinct from one or more of its islands and from its connectivity. Christy, please do not be offended. Such a book could depict it in the period which we have been reviewing as being simultaneously an amphitheatre, a battleground, an extended marketplace, and a forcing house of political, economic, and cultural innovation. I would love to write that book, but I never shall. The second is that in welcome compensation, and in spite of Nikos Giannakopoulos' heroic efforts, it has not been about the whole of Greece, or about the whole of antiquity, but about Greece, archaic to Hellenistic. Still huge, but far more manageable. The third comment is that in an equally welcome compensation, but with formidably complex consequences, it has not reflected change simpliciter, but rather two sorts of change. First, historical change within cultures and polities, taking place in real ancient time. And second, historiographical change within the discipline, taking place certainly in my lifetime and continuing as we speak this weekend. Each of these two forms of change has sometimes been hard to describe precisely, and the relationship between the two kinds of change is complicated. As I first read and then heard your papers, therefore, I have been mentally posing four questions. How do you detect change? How do you diagnose its nature? How do you measure it? And how do you account for it? And the variety of your answers has been fascinating. I am not going to attempt to discuss all 17 of them in detail, since that would do justice to none of them. Instead, I shall try to identify a typology on the basis of a selection. Please do not feel offended if your name does not recur. Type 1 is simple, deconstruction. It has two subtypes. The first of which is the deconstruction of the reliability of an ancient text. David Lewis's paper well exemplified it, with his argument that the author of the Athenaion Politeia had no actual evidence for Solon's economic reforms other than Solon's own poems, which he interpreted in the light of an Aristotelian ideological system, and therefore woefully misinterpreted the nature of the distress of the free poor and underestimated the importance of slavery, both then and later, in contributing to the economic growth of Attica. The second subtype has been the deconstruction of a modern interpretation, for which Nikos Giannakopoulos' study of the politics of the Greek city in the early imperial Roman period served as one excellent example. Here, the establishment figure was A.H.M. Jones, whose picture of powerful permanent councils exercising unchecked power he challenges quite sharply. He did so both by demonstrating that assemblies did exercise significant formal power and by pointing out the reality of conflicts within the elite. Marek Bijakowski's attack on several aspects of the archaic narrative provides a second valuable example. Though his target is not a single identifiable modern author, so much as an established academic terminology, which is imprecise to the point of being unsafe to use. These two studies have in common that they are primarily historiographical and that they are advocating change in modern interpretations. A second type is purely historical, the exploration of movements of behavior from pattern A to pattern B and perhaps beyond. I think this has been the predominant mode. Here, the organizer's framework has clearly shaped your response. Within each of the task areas to which they had married a participant, the pattern of response was to identify one pathway of change and to document it in the appropriate way. Such studies have been primarily concerned with exploring and with making evaluations of the tensions and oscillations involved, typically by using, for the sake of clarity, a very limited number of examples which are analyzed in some detail. I cite 3 instances only out of many. Thus, for example, Manuela Mari's paper, which we have just heard, on religious change, began very helpfully by sketching the intrinsic tension between conservatism in public matters and innovations, new gods, new festivals, etc., and went on not only to describe in some detail the ways in which such innovation could be promoted and managed, e.g. by appeal to a tradition or to an oracle, but also to detect the mechanisms which limited such innovation. We can all recognize how timeless and widespread this pattern of behavior is. In contrast, a second presentation in this group, Edward Harris's paper on the education of ephebes, was initially very specific in time and space. I hope he and others will not mind my saying that I found it a most valuable example, educational for me as well as for the ephebes. Its structure was simple. It used a newly published document about the education of ephebes, dating from the early Augustan period, in order to show how pattern A, i.e. the assumption, which is prominent in 4th century texts, that the laws of a state would by themselves provide the necessary education in behavior and citizenship, was increasingly supplemented both by pattern B, systems of rewards and honors for worthy adults, and by pattern C, the systems of formal training for male teenagers, which the new document exemplifies. He then goes further to see the growth of evidence for the conferment of honors on fellow citizens and the development of dramatic and musical festivals as associated processes. This is a remarkable and persuasive construct, which we have been privileged to hear and to learn from. My third example from this large group is, and must be, that of Paolo Ceccarelli, who probably had the hardest job of all of us, as Hans and Edward have said. But it was also, in some ways, the job which was cultivating the widest and most fruitful field of all. However, though she tackled all 3 components of her title head on, I leave aside sources and literary in order to concentrate on change itself. I do so because, as emerged both from her presentation and from this morning's discussion, the term applied so widely to the choice of words by one author or by a succession of authors, to occasion, to audience, to patronal pressure, to form and genre, to theme, and even to the changing presentation of a real or imaginary figure in successive sources. Steve Hodkinson quoted the example of Periandros, tyrant of Corinth, but I was thinking to myself that the list of representations of such figures, from Alexander and Andromache through Odysseus to Zeus, is endless and shows no sign of stopping in our own day. All of which is not to say that epigraphic or monetary or material change were any simpler. Today's menu has offered a very high protein diet indeed. But I now move to type 3, the use of a theoretical model. And again, I pick out 3 examples from the papers that we have heard. First, Gunnar Seelentag's contribution, which also exemplifies another common feature, the use of models borrowed from the social sciences. I have commented elsewhere on the advantages which that practice can provide, but also about its risks. Here, I see nothing but huge benefit. He sketches a theoretical model taken from Georg Simmel, which damps down the social damage caused by pattern A, intra-elite conflicts, by generating as pattern B systems of cartelization and homogenization within which honor and power is shared out equably. Though he did not cite the particular instance which came to my mind, one may readily recall that much is the same is said in our historical sources about the Bacchiadae of Corinth, who I think indeed actually would count as his best documented instance. My second example here is Kostas Vlasopoulos' demolition job on so much that has been part of the inherited conglomerate. I could obviously have instanced this paper as an example of type 1 deconstruction, but it was not all deconstruction, so it is sui generis. He reminded us all that the implicit dialogue among practitioners of our discipline, I would say at least the last 30 years or so, has seen, or of course brought about, the collapse of 3 major social narratives. First, the notion that in the beginning, whenever that was, there were aristocracies, but that they lost power and actively or passively democratized themselves, a notion that was killed and buried in 1976. Secondly, the notion of a transition from societies with slaves, scilicet as in Homer, to slave societies, a notion which the Homeric poems themselves underline. And thirdly, the notion of a crisis of a polis in the late 4th century and onwards, a notion which I hope I helped bury myself in my chapter in 1984. More helpfully, he did exactly what I'm fond of doing myself, namely to notice absences in Greek societies. The lack of systems of direct control of social relationships, the lack of medieval monastery-style predominant control of resources and manpower by temples and guilds. I slightly cut back against that, but let that pass for the moment. The lack of solidified hierarchies and the lack of practices and rituals of deference. So he sees Greek social structures as unstable and inchoate, being underpinned by wealth or leisure, by an honor code, and by a sharp distinction between free and slave. As far as I can judge at the moment, this is right. And I have no doubt that this time, this one would run and run. And I hope I can continue to take part in the argument. It is a real and primordial one. My third example is Vincent Gabrielson's paper, a very concentrated and condensed sketch of a whole process of linked economic cum civic development of institutional practices. It really needs to be book length in order to reveal its immense persuasive and analytical force. He delineates not one shift from pattern A to pattern B, but a whole reconfiguration of public economic change. The core seems actually to be the simplification of maritime activity, initially comprising 3 archaic early classical institutions, navies, piracy, and market trade, into 2, by the demonization of piracy as a bad thing, and the transformation of the remainder into fully fledged state formation and mature market formation. All of these 3 papers have high and wide range explanatory force. And as with many others that we have just heard, they will be, I think, a leading body of thought for some considerable time to come. I end this review, however, with a paper which is also sui generis and carries a very serious challenge. Christy Costantakopoulou's paper is all about changes in attitudes. Her first section is a complex twin-track exercise, being in part about historical change, the effect on the Aegean of the 5th century empire, but in part, in perhaps greater part, about the need for modern historical attitudes towards the empire and towards the term classical period to emancipate themselves. Secondly, she challenges the relativization of spaces other than the polis-populated south central mainland of Greece, emphasizing that locality matters and that archaeological discourses are much better in not being restricted by a polis-centric narrative. I have said much the same myself, and I am learning very rapidly by being concerned in the publication of the papers from a 2017 conference in Rome about Macedonia, which proves the point about moving north from the south central mainland very clearly indeed. Thirdly, she berates the modern classical narrative for having white male citizen privilege as its heart, not least because of the toxic message which that conveys to a public that she reckons does exist. Most of this is about, therefore, about the historiographical change which is needed but has not yet happened. And I think we need to hear what she says. A glance at Katerina's and Vlasos's original manifesto reminds us that their list of aspects and queries is an invitation to complexity. Forms of change, periodization, narratives, temporal and spatial dimensions, models, and agency. That list is itself a huge marker of historiographical change within our discipline. 60 years ago, perhaps even 30 years ago, it would not have used the terminology of the social sciences so confidently. But I think the diagnosis of the challenge which lies behind it is inescapable. As soon as one leaves the comforting familiarity of narrating a linear narrative of events within a single political unit, problems of structure impinge from every side and require tools of a different shape, which are and have to be handled and manipulated differently. My main general response to everything which has been said in these 3 days is not, as perhaps Kostas Buraselis was fearing, that I would be trying to demolish parts of it, but on the contrary, very much on the contrary, one of intense admiration and respect for what my colleagues have been saying. This is not flattery, this is an honest evaluation. These papers have clearly been the product of intense independent thought on the part of everyone, conducted within an open-minded international milieu, which is itself a delight, which feels itself able and free to find, choose, and then use conceptual tools that are drawn from a very wide assortment of initial disciplines. Their range and style is far removed from the rather formal, very learned, and strongly compartmentalized scholarly world of Altertumswissenschaft that I recall from my youth in the 1960s. But what I hear and see now has not lost its rigor, but has gained in humanity and in its connectivity to the wider scholarly and scientific world. It has been a privilege to have participated in these 3 days of discussion, and the thought that in various ways I have been at its center is still hard to comprehend. All I can do, once again, is to thank you all, to wish you well in your various struggles to cope with the modern world as well as with the ancient world, and to bid you a formal but affectionate farewell. Thank you.
The applause is strong, although not heard. Well, we thank you, John. I think I may express the feelings of all of us, saying that it has been a nice privilege to attend the part of these 3 days every one of us was able to afford. And in your name and in the name of all people that have somehow participated, I may thank again Katerina and Kostas for the real dedication they have invested into saving this project. It is something that has happened not with the help of the time, but exactly despite the difficulties of time. It's a small act of heroism. Thank you very much for that. And the word goes now back to Katerina and Kostas for concluding the whole journey with their remarks. Thank you very much.
Dear John, dear Chair, dear colleagues, friends, dear head of our department, Pavlina Karanastasi, dear all of you. Just to say that once more, the power of the individual, the title of the volume produced by Zosha and Ian is again confirmed today. We did enjoy a wonderful 3-day conference, thanks to you all, thanks to John, and it's thanks to John's emotional intelligence that we all try to do our best and to try to keep up to not easy task. I mean, that's the topic of the conference was not easy, but we all try to do our best and address it as well as we could from our little part. Our forum, we are, okay, we had to tackle unusual circumstances. The COVID experience made us wiser. But at the end of the day, I must say that our forum, we are glad that our forum became far wider. There were so many friends of John's from so many countries who were able to attend and who are attending now, from the US, from Italy, from the UK, all colleagues and friends of his who are extremely we are extremely glad that they have been with us. I would like to thank all conference participants, all the panelists, all chairs, fellow colleagues who did their best to keep up with the time. We do thank the head of our department, Pavlina Karanastasi, director and the dean for actually agreeing to nominate John as an honorary doctor of our department. The Institute of Mediterranean Studies is to be cordially thanked. Zelina Harlafti, the director of the Institute, provided for us a really welcome forum. Aris Kidanakis, the IT person, did absolutely his best to keep up with the challenge, and we try to invent new ways of making up for all the discussions and things that take place in a conference, which we could not have in this in this form. We do thank our Chorigos, the Foundation of Athena and Athanasios, and Marina Martinu, without whose support this conference would not have been possible. John, we're ever so grateful to you. It is a great pity, I should say this, that our MA students did not get to meet you all, but we would like to thank them for being there, for participating in the first section of the conference. So therefore, Irini Stagouraki, Milan Prodanovic, Lydia Pangali, Achilleas Economou are cordially thankful for their help, their support, and their energy in the first part of the conference. Ούπολου δέομεν χάριν έχειν to COVID-19 for having this conversion. We became much wiser. We thought differently about the event. But we, out of all, John, we thank you for being the person you are, for being a human in the humanities. We're all thankful for you, for your work, for your insight, for your insightful comments on our papers at the end. And we very much hope and look forward to having you live at some point in the next academic year for the actual nomination, and for many, many, many years to come to comment on all our thoughts, and to be there as always. I was wondering whether Kostas would like to say a few words on this.
No, I have nothing to add. I think you and John basically said everything. Just to add to the conference participants that we plan to publish the proceedings of this conference, so you will hear shortly from us. Apart from that, I don't think I have anything else to say. So back to you.
I'm not sure whether you would like to have some discussion afterwards. We would like, if I may say this, well, I should add to the outcome of the conference, of course, an honorary decree, which has been more or less sketched by some of the fellow panelists. I'm not sure, well, we'll elaborate this and submit it to the demos and see what the demo says. I'm not sure whether we will be able to offer you a golden crown, John.
I wish.
The demos will decide. But we thank you all for having made this a wonderful occasion. I'm not sure whether you would like to hang around for a bit longer just for a discussion.
As long as I can. I may have to go by about half past 7 in terms of what you're saying, because there may be a telephone call which I have to answer.
Yeah, okay.
But certainly.
So if you would like to stay a little bit longer to discuss something.
By all means. Mm.
Unfortunately, as we said, there will be no flows of raki through the internet.
I know. Well, that was why I mentioned the glass of wine.
John, I have written a proxeny decree for you where I declare you proxenus and kai euergetis of the koinon of the participants. But I think after your final remarks, I will throw in Epifanestato topo and a statue and an Andreas and everything else. I will expand many more lines and substantive clauses about, your great benefactors.
Maybe you should read the decree now, Christy.
So, this came up when Ed Harris in his paper mentioned the honorary degree for John. I thought, yay, I'll write an honorary degree. So I wrote, Έδωξε το εικονό των συνέδρων εν Rethymna, Konstantinos εν γραμμάουτευε, Katerina είπεν, Peidei Ioannis Davidos ανέρα καθώς ον διατελέει περί το κοινών των ιστορικών καί των φυτετών, καί χρέιας παρέχεται κοινέι, kai dia tois en την χάνωση αυτών των συνέδρων kai των άλλων ιστορικών eis ha antis heαυτόν παρακαλέει, de dochtai το koino, Ιωάννην Davidos πρόξενον είναι kai ευεργέτεν koinu, kai aton, kai εγκόνους αουτού, kai επενέσα Ιωάννην, αναγράψε δε το ψέφισμα εις διαδικτυακέν σανίδα, Χριστίνα επεψήφισεν. There you are. I'll expand it. Okay.
Paschalis Paschidis writes that there are 16 likes in the decree drafted by Christy, which is more or less the modern equivalent of a heirotonia. So he thinks that the decree has been ratified, and I think he's absolutely right.
Hey, thank you for that. May I, first of all, thank you. And second, to say that I did exactly the same thing myself about 25 years ago when Frank Warbank retired, and I composed an honorary decree for him, indeed, obviously in Greek, and sent it to him. So, Christy, you are, we are copying each other.
I don't believe this is the hugest praise I could ever ask for, that I'm actually channeling your younger you towards Frank Warbank. I think this is amazing. Okay. Now it's left to the organizers to find someone to actually carve this in marble block. Absolutely. And present it as a proper stele too.
Well, maybe we should ask for the experience of our prehistoric colleagues. If Artemi Karnava is still listening to us, don't you have the tradition of composing a linear B tablet after each missinological conference? Yeah, maybe Artemis doesn't.
No. Hi, I can hear you. Yes, but I could draft something. I'm not so sure you would want to read it, though.
Okay. Well, it's in like maybe you could do a ciprosyllabic as well too.
Well, I would address myself to an even smaller audience of people, but if you want to, you know, I can give it a try.
Well, maybe it's not a bad idea for the conference, the volume that will come out of this conference to have the marble stele and the linear B tablet and the ciprosyllabic inscription included.
You know, we have one of our conferences in prehistory, Aegean, every time Tom Palaima drafts.
That's what I was referring to.
A new tablet, yes. So a new linear B tablet, and the text, of course, is appropriately, it fits. And he does a proper transcription, and he shares his wisdom with everybody. So
brilliant, very good idea.
Yes.
Will there be a copy posted to Liverpool? I'm sure the postage on packaging isn't too much.
I'm sure it can be procured somehow.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody from Gabrielsen. Thank you so much for this. I have to go now. Goodbye.
Greetings.
Bye. Thank you very much.
I also have to go and do dinner because they're hungry.
Until the next meeting, then. This is the only thing one could add, I think. It is nice to end something having the feeling that it will continue. And I think we have all this feeling at this moment, John. Once again, thank you very much for organizing this.
Well,
thank you very much.
Thank you to everyone.
Thank you very much.
We look forward, John, we look forward to having you in Crete next academic year. So that is our definite appointment. Hopefully we'll be able to make it earlier, but you know, at least during next academic year, we will set up the nomination ceremony. So that will be an event.
That will be splendid. Thank you.
And Katerina, let us know the date.
Yes, of course.
Be able to come, we'll all come.
That would be lovely.
Exactly. We will discuss with Kostas how we could do it. So in order to at least have you in, or even at least electronically, but we'll see if we can do something about this to make up for you know, the conference which did not take place in the right time with the nomination. But anyway, John, thank you so much for everything. I mean, we thank you all for coming, for being there, for participating. It was for the lively discussions. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Looking forward to see you in Crete, John.
Indeed, indeed.
Thank you.
It will happen.
Yes. Looking forward to see you all in Crete.
Yeah, indeed, indeed.